Sarah Martinez walked through the pristine corridors of the Veterans Affairs Office, her heels clicking against the polished floor with each determined step. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the tension lines around her eyes. She clutched a manila folder containing years of medical records, documentation, and photographs that told a story most people refused to believe. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer screen when Sarah approached the desk. "I have an appointment with Colonel Thompson at 2 o'clock, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. This was her third attempt to get her disability claim approved, and she knew this meeting could determine whether she would finally receive the recognition and support she deserved for her service. Colonel James Thompson was a man who commanded respect without saying a word. His office walls were lined with military commendations, photographs with high-ranking officials, and memorabilia from his 30-year career in the Army. When Sarah entered his office, he remained seated behind his mahogany desk, his gray eyes scanning the paperwork before him with the precision of someone who had reviewed thousands of similar cases. "Ms. Martinez," he said without looking up, "I've reviewed your file. You're claiming service-connected disabilities from your deployment in Afghanistan, specifically related to an IED explosion in Kandahar province in 2019. His tone was matter-of-fact, clinical, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a life-changing event that had left Sarah with invisible wounds and very real scars. Sarah nodded, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Yes, sir. I was serving as a medic with the 82nd Airborne when our convoy hit an improvised explosive device. The blast threw me from our vehicle and left me unconscious for several hours. I sustained multiple injuries, including traumatic brain injury, hearing loss, and severe PTSD. Colonel Thompson finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "According to the initial medical reports from the field hospital, you were treated for minor cuts and bruises. There's no documentation of any serious injuries requiring extensive medical intervention." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I've seen this before. Ms. Martinez. Soldiers who come back from deployment and suddenly develop mysterious ailments that weren't properly documented during their service." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected skepticism, but the dismissive tone in his voice made her chest tighten with frustration. "Sir, with all due respect, the field hospital was overwhelmed that day. We had multiple casualties from several attacks. The medical staff was focused on life-threatening injuries. My symptoms didn't fully manifest until weeks later when I returned to base." "Convenient," Thompson muttered, making a note in her file. "Tell me about these symptoms you claim to have developed." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she knew would be an uphill battle. "The headaches started about 2 weeks after the explosion. They weren't just regular headaches, they were debilitating. I would wake up feeling like someone was driving nails into my skull. The hearing loss in my right ear became apparent when I couldn't hear commands during training exercises. But the worst part was the nightmares and flashbacks." Thompson's pen stopped moving across the paper. "PTSD is a serious diagnosis, Ms. Martinez. It requires substantial evidence and proper psychiatric evaluation. I don't see any documentation from military psychiatrists in your initial treatment records." "Because I didn't want to admit I was struggling," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know how it is in the military. Showing mental weakness can end your career. I thought I could push through it, that it would get better with time. But it didn't, it got worse." The colonel's expression remained unmoved. "So you're asking me to approve disability benefits based on self-diagnosed conditions that weren't properly documented during your active duty service? Ms. Martinez, do you understand the implications of what you're requesting? These benefits are meant for veterans with legitimate documented injuries sustained in the line of duty." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. "Sir, I understand the system, but I also understand what happened to my body and my mind during that deployment. I've been seeing civilian doctors for 3 years now. I have brain scans showing traumatic injury, audiograms proving hearing loss, and psychological evaluations confirming PTSD. The evidence is all right here." She gestured to her folder. "Civilian doctors," Thompson repeated with a slight shake of his head. "Ms. Martinez, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen countless veterans come through this office with claims that don't hold up under scrutiny. The civilian medical community sometimes has a different understanding of what constitutes service-connected disabilities. Sarah's hands clenched into fists in her lap. Are you suggesting that multiple medical professionals are lying about my condition? I'm suggesting that without proper documentation from the time of the alleged incident, it's impossible to establish a clear connection between your current complaints and your military service. The burden of proof lies with you, and frankly, the evidence you've presented is insufficient. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah stared at the man across from her, a fellow veteran who should have understood the complexities of combat injuries and the challenges of getting proper medical care in a war zone. Instead, she saw someone who had become so entrenched in bureaucracy that he had lost sight of the human cost of military service. Colonel Thompson, Sarah said slowly, what would it take for you to believe that I'm telling the truth about what happened to me? Thompson closed her file and leaned forward. Substantial evidence, Ms. Martinez. Something more than subjective complaints and civilian medical opinions. I need concrete proof that your alleged injuries are directly related to your military service, not pre-existing conditions or civilian accidents that occurred after your discharge. Sarah stood up, her folder clutched tightly against her chest. And if I can provide that evidence? Then we'll revisit your case, Thompson said, his tone suggesting he didn't expect to see her again. But until then, I'm afraid I have to recommend denial of your disability claim. You have the right to appeal this decision, of course. As Sarah walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at the colonel. I will appeal this decision, sir. And when I do, I'll make sure you have all the evidence you need to understand exactly what happened to me in Afghanistan. Thompson barely acknowledged her words, already reaching for the next file on his desk. Sarah left his office with a mixture of disappointment and determination burning in her chest. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she had something Colonel Thompson hadn't seen yet, something that would make him reconsider everything he thought he knew about her case. 3 weeks after her meeting with Colonel Thompson, Sarah sat in the waiting room of Dr. Elizabeth Chen's medical practice. Dr. Chen was a neurologist who specialized in traumatic brain injuries, particularly those sustained by military personnel. Sarah had been seeing her for over a year, and Dr. Chen had become more than just her doctor, she had become an advocate. Sarah, come in, Dr. Chen said, opening the door to her office. She was a petite woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the sterile government building where Sarah had met with Colonel Thompson. Sarah settled into the comfortable chair across from Dr. Chen's desk. I need your help with something, Doc. The VA denied my disability claim again. Colonel Thompson says there isn't enough evidence to prove my injuries are service-connected. Dr. Chen frowned as she pulled up Sarah's file on her computer. That's ridiculous. We've documented extensive evidence of traumatic brain injury, consistent with blast exposure. Your neurological symptoms, the cognitive impairments, the headache patterns, they're all classic presentations of TBI from explosive devices. He wants substantial evidence, Sarah said, making air quotes with her fingers. He basically accused me of making it all up or suggested my problem started after I left the military. Well, let's give him substantial evidence then, Dr. Chen said with determination in her voice. I want to order some additional tests. We'll do a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation, updated brain imaging, and I want to document something else, something I noticed during your last examination, but didn't include in my report because you asked me not to. Sarah looked puzzled. What are you talking about? Dr. Chen leaned forward. Sarah, during your physical examination last month, I noticed what appeared to be small metallic fragments embedded in your scalp and neck area. When I asked about them, you became uncomfortable and changed the subject. I respected your privacy then, but now I think those fragments might be crucial evidence for your case. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her neck, her fingers finding the small, hard bumps beneath her skin that she had tried so hard to ignore. I didn't want to make a big deal about them. They don't really hurt unless I press on them, and I figured they were too small to matter. Sarah, those fragments are likely shrapnel from the IED explosion. They're physical evidence of the blast trauma you sustained. If we can document them properly, photograph them, and possibly even extract a few for analysis, it would provide undeniable proof that you were injured in that explosion. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a spark of hope. You really think that would make a difference? I think it would make Colonel Thompson eat his words, Dr. Chen said with a slight smile. Shrapnel doesn't lie, Sarah. It doesn't develop 3 years after discharge. It doesn't appear because of pre-existing conditions. It's there because you were in an explosion that embedded pieces of metal in your body. Dr. Chen stood up and moved to her examination table. Let me take another look. I want to map out exactly how many fragments we're dealing with and where they're located. With your permission, I'd like to photograph them and include detailed documentation in your medical record. Sarah nodded and moved to the examination table. As Dr. Chen gently examined her scalp and neck area, Sarah found herself remembering that day in Afghanistan with startling clarity. She could almost smell the acrid smoke, hear the ringing in her ears that lasted for hours after the blast, feel the confusion and disorientation as she tried to help other wounded soldiers despite her own injuries. I count at least 12 visible fragments, Dr. Chen said, her voice clinical but sympathetic. Some are quite small, barely perceptible, but others are more substantial. The pattern is consistent with blast fragmentation injuries. Sarah, why haven't you mentioned these before to other doctors? Sarah's voice was quiet when she answered. Because they remind me of that day. Every time I touch them or think about them, I'm back there. I hear the explosion, smell the burning metal, see Jackson bleeding out in front of me while I couldn't help him because my head was spinning so badly I could barely stand up. Dr. Chen paused in her examination. Jackson? Private Jackson Miller. He was 19 years old, just deployed 2 months earlier. He took the worst of the blast. I was supposed to save him, that's what medics do. But I was so disoriented from my own injuries that I couldn't function properly. He died because I couldn't do my job. Sarah, you need to understand something, Dr. Chen said firmly. The fact that you were injured in the blast doesn't mean you failed Jackson. It means you were a victim too. These fragments in your body are proof that you sustained significant trauma. The disorientation, the cognitive difficulties you experienced, they were symptoms of a brain injury, not personal weakness or professional failure. Tears began to flow down Sarah's cheeks as years of suppressed guilt and trauma began to surface. I should have been stronger. I should have pushed through it. You couldn't push through a traumatic brain injury, Sarah. That's not how the brain works. When you sustain that kind of trauma, your cognitive functions are impaired through no fault of your own. You're not responsible for Jackson's death, and you're certainly not responsible for the military's failure to properly document your injuries at the time. Dr. Chen continued her examination, taking detailed photographs of each fragment she could identify.
I'm going to prepare a comprehensive report for Colonel Thompson.
I want him to see exactly what blast trauma looks like, not just in brain scans and psychological evaluations, but in the physical evidence embedded in your body. As the examination concluded, Dr. Chen sat down at her computer and began typing. I'm also going to recommend that we consult with a forensic pathologist who specializes in blast injuries, someone who can provide expert testimony about the nature of these fragments and what they tell us about the explosion you survived. Do you really think this will change Colonel Thompson's mind? Sarah asked, hope and skepticism battling in her voice. I think it will be very difficult for him to argue with physical evidence, Dr. Chen replied. But more importantly, Sarah, I think this documentation will help you understand that your injuries are real, significant, and directly related to your service. You've been carrying guilt and doubt for years because people question the validity of your experiences. This evidence validates everything you've been saying. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her. For the first time since her discharge from the military, she felt like someone truly understood what she had been through. The fragments in her body weren't just pieces of metal, they were proof of her sacrifice. Evidence of a day when she had put her life on the line for her country and paid a price that had been ignored for far too long. What's our next step? Sarah asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. We document everything, Dr. Chen said with conviction. We create a medical record so detailed and comprehensive that Colonel Thompson will have no choice but to acknowledge the truth about your service-connected disabilities. And then we make sure every other veteran facing similar skepticism benefits from the precedent we're about to set. As Sarah left Dr. Chen's office that day, she carried with her not just updated medical records and photographs, but something more valuable, the knowledge that her pain had been real, her injuries were legitimate, and she was finally going to get the recognition she deserved. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she organized the new documentation Dr. Chen had prepared. The manila folder from her first meeting with Colonel Thompson had grown substantially thicker, now containing high-resolution photographs of the shrapnel, fragments, detailed medical reports from 3 different specialists, and a forensic analysis that left no doubt about the nature of her injuries. 2 months had passed since her initial claim denial, and Sarah had used every day to build an ironclad case. She had tracked down other soldiers from her unit who could testify about the explosion, obtained satellite imagery of the blast site from military records, and even located the medic who had initially treated her in the field hospital that chaotic day in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had been the senior medic on duty when Sarah was brought in after the IED explosion. He agreed to meet Sarah at a small diner outside the city, away from official military facilities. Marcus was a career soldier, with 20 years of service, and his weathered face spoke of countless deployments and difficult situations. "I remember that day clearly," Marcus told Sarah as they sat across from each other in a worn vinyl booth. "We had multiple casualties coming in from 3 different incidents. It was chaos. You were conscious when they brought you in, but you kept asking the same questions over and over. Classic signs of concussion. Do you remember what my initial injuries looked like?" Sarah asked, hoping Marcus could fill in the gaps that the sparse medical records had left. "You had blood coming from your ears, which immediately told me we were dealing with potential inner ear damage from the blast pressure. There were multiple small lacerations on your scalp and neck, and when I tried to clean them, I felt what seemed like debris embedded under the skin. But honestly, Sarah, you weren't my priority that day." Marcus paused, his expression growing somber. "Private Miller was dying on the table next to you. We had a soldier with a severed artery, another with a collapsed lung. Your injuries seemed minor in comparison, so after we stabilized your vitals and cleaned your visible wounds, we moved you to the observation area. That was probably a mistake." "Why a mistake?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because blast injuries are tricky. The initial presentation doesn't always tell the whole story. The brain trauma, the embedded fragments, the inner ear damage, they can all present as minor issues initially, but develop into serious problems over time. If I had been more thorough, if the situation hadn't been so chaotic, we might have documented your injuries properly from the beginning." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. "I've kept personal logs of every major incident I've dealt with over the years. It's not official documentation, but I have notes about that day. I wrote that you seemed confused and disoriented beyond what would be expected from minor cuts and bruises. I also noted that you kept trying to get up to help other patients despite my instructions to remain lying down." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who barely knew her but was willing to help validate her experiences. "Would you be willing to provide an official statement for my disability appeal?" "Absolutely," Marcus said without hesitation. "What happened to you wasn't right, Sarah. The system failed you, and it's failed too many other veterans who got caught up in the chaos of war zones, where proper documentation became secondary to immediate survival." Armed with Marcus's statement and Dr. Chen's comprehensive medical evidence, Sarah felt ready to face Colonel Thompson again. But first, she wanted to visit one more person, someone who could provide perspective on the psychological impact of her untreated injuries. Dr. Michael Harrison was a clinical psychologist who specialized in PTSD and combat trauma. Sarah had been seeing him for 8 months, working through the nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt that had plagued her since her return from Afghanistan. Dr. Harrison's office was in a converted Victorian house, and his approach to therapy was both professional and compassionate. "Sarah, I've prepared a detailed psychological evaluation for your appeal," Dr. Harrison said during their session. "But I want to discuss something with you before you face Colonel Thompson again. Your PTSD isn't just about the explosion itself. Much of your ongoing trauma stems from the invalidation you've experienced since returning home." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "When trauma survivors are repeatedly told their experiences aren't real or legitimate, it creates what we call secondary trauma. You've been fighting 2 battles, one against your war injuries and another against a system that refused to acknowledge those injuries existed. That secondary battle has actually intensified your PTSD symptoms." Dr. Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "I want you to understand that when you walk into Colonel Thompson's office this time, you're not just advocating for disability benefits. You're reclaiming your truth. You're standing up not just for yourself, but for every veteran who has been dismissed or doubted when they came home wounded. I'm nervous about facing him again, Sarah admitted. What if he still doesn't believe me, even with all this new evidence? Then he'll have to explain how he's dismissing the testimony of multiple medical professionals, a senior military medic, forensic evidence and photographic documentation of shrapnel embedded in your body. At some point, denying your claim becomes more difficult than approving it. Dr. Harrison handed Sarah a thick report. This psychological evaluation details not just your PTSD symptoms, but also how the denial of your claim has affected your mental health. I've included recommendations for treatment and an assessment of how your cognitive symptoms from the TBI have impacted your ability to work and function in daily life. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, spreading out all her documentation like pieces of a puzzle. The photographs of her shrapnel scars seemed to tell the story more powerfully than any written report. Each small dark fragment visible beneath her skin was a piece of evidence that couldn't be argued away or dismissed as subjective. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Dr. Chen's name on the caller ID. Sarah, I have some additional information that might interest you. I spoke with a colleague who specializes in metallurgy. He's willing to analyze one of the fragments if we can safely extract it. The metal composition could potentially be matched to the type of explosive device used in that specific attack. Really? That's possible? Modern forensic science can do remarkable things. If we can prove that the metal in your body matches the explosive device from that day in Afghanistan, it becomes impossible to argue that your injuries aren't service-connected. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Would the extraction be dangerous? Minimal risk. These fragments are superficial, just under the skin. It would be a simple outpatient procedure. But Sarah, you should know that this level of evidence is extraordinary. Most veterans never get the chance to provide this kind of conclusive proof. After hanging up the phone, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, gently touching the small bumps along her hairline and neck. For years, she had seen these fragments as reminders of failure and trauma. Now she began to see them differently as proof of her service, evidence of a sacrifice that demanded recognition and respect. Tomorrow, she would call Colonel Thompson's office to schedule another meeting. This time, she wouldn't be asking him to believe her story. She would be presenting him with facts, evidence, and truth that spoke louder than any skepticism or bureaucratic resistance. The fragments beneath her skin had been silent witnesses to her trauma for years. Now they were about to become her most powerful advocates in the fight for justice and recognition. Colonel Thompson's secretary seemed surprised when Sarah called to request another meeting. Ms. Martinez, didn't the colonel already rule on your case? I believe your claim was denied. Yes, ma'am, but I have significant new evidence that needs to be reviewed before I file my formal appeal, Sarah replied, keeping her voice professional despite the frustration she felt. I believe Colonel Thompson will want to see this documentation before the case goes to the appeals board. 3 days later, Sarah found herself once again walking through the corridors of the Veterans Affairs office. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Dr. Chen had agreed to accompany her, along with Marcus Rodriguez, who had taken leave time to support Sarah's appeal. The three of them presented a united front as they entered Colonel Thompson's office. Thompson looked up from his desk with obvious irritation. Ms. Martinez, I thought I made myself clear during our last meeting. Your case has been thoroughly reviewed and denied. Bringing additional people to this meeting isn't going to change the facts. Sir, with respect, I believe you'll find that the facts have changed considerably since our last conversation, Sarah said, placing a substantially thicker folder on his desk. I've brought Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the neurologist who has been treating my traumatic brain injury, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, who was the senior medic who treated me immediately after the IED explosion in Afghanistan. Thompson's expression remained skeptical, but Sarah noticed his eyes linger on Marcus's military bearing and the ribbons on his dress uniform. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you're claiming to have treated Ms. Martinez in 2019? Yes, sir, Marcus replied crisply. At Forward Operating Base Chapman, following the IED attack on her convoy in Kandahar province. I was the senior medic on duty that day, and I have personal documentation of her treatment. Thompson opened Sarah's new folder and immediately stopped at the first photograph. His face changed subtly as he examined the high-resolution image showing the dark fragments beneath Sarah's skin. What exactly am I looking at here? Dr. Chen leaned forward. Colonel Thompson, those are metallic fragments embedded in Ms. Martinez's scalp and neck area. They are consistent with shrapnel from an explosive device. I've documented 12 visible fragments, and metallurgical analysis confirms they are composed of materials commonly found in improvised explosive devices. Metallurgical analysis? Thompson repeated, his voice losing some of its earlier certainty. Yes, sir, Sarah said, pulling out another document. We had one fragment safely extracted and analyzed by a forensic metallurgist. The composition matches the type of explosive device that was used in the attack on my convoy. This isn't speculation or subjective symptoms, Colonel. This is physical evidence embedded in my body. Thompson continued flipping through the photographs, his expression growing more serious with each image. The fragments were clearly visible, and the medical documentation was extensive. Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, when were these fragments embedded? Based on the healing patterns, scar tissue formation, and the victim's testimony, these fragments were embedded during a high-velocity explosive event approximately 3 years ago. The pattern and depth are consistent with blast fragmentation from an IED explosion. Marcus stepped forward and placed his notebook on the desk. Sir, I have my personal logs from that day. The medical tent was overwhelmed with casualties, and many injuries that should have been documented more thoroughly were given minimal attention due to the emergency situation. Ms. Martinez presented with confusion, disorientation, blood from her ears, and multiple lacerations. In my notes, I specifically mentioned feeling what seemed like debris under her skin when I cleaned her wounds. Why wasn't this documented in her official medical record? Thompson asked, though his tone had shifted from accusatory to genuinely questioning. Because Private Miller was dying on the table next to her, Marcus replied bluntly. Because we had a soldier with a severed artery and another with a collapsed lung. Because in a war zone, sometimes you have to prioritize who lives over who gets proper paperwork. That doesn't mean her injuries were less real. Thompson was quiet for several minutes as he continued reviewing the documentation. Sarah watched his face carefully, seeing something she hadn't expected: doubt in his own previous assessment. When he looked up again, his expression was troubled. Ms. Martinez, this evidence is substantial, he admitted slowly. The photographic documentation, the metallurgical analysis, the testimony from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, these are not things that can be fabricated or misinterpreted. No, sir, they're not, Sarah replied quietly. This is what I've been trying to tell you from the beginning. I was injured in that explosion, and those injuries have affected every aspect of my life since that day. Dr. Chen placed additional documents on the desk. Colonel, I've also included updated neurological testing that shows clear evidence of traumatic brain injury, consistent with blast exposure. The cognitive impairments, hearing loss, and chronic headaches that Ms. Martinez experiences are directly related to the brain trauma she sustained. Thompson picked up a brain scan image, studying it carefully. Dr. Chen, I'm not a medical professional. Can you explain what I'm looking at here? The darker areas here and here show tissue damage in regions of the brain, typically affected by blast injuries. This type of damage doesn't occur from mild concussions or normal head injuries. It's specifically associated with the pressure waves created by explosive devices. Combined with the physical evidence of shrapnel, it creates a clear picture of what happened to Ms. Martinez. Sarah watched as Thompson's professional facade began to crack. She could see the realization dawning on his face that he had been wrong, that he had dismissed a legitimate case based on incomplete information and bureaucratic skepticism. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Thompson said, addressing Marcus directly. In your professional opinion, why do you think these injuries weren't properly documented at the time? Marcus didn't hesitate. Sir, the system failed. We were overwhelmed, understaffed, and focused on immediate life-threatening injuries. Ms. Martinez's wounds didn't seem critical in comparison to soldiers who were actively dying. But that doesn't mean they weren't serious, and it certainly doesn't mean they weren't service-connected. Thompson closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. For the first time since Sarah had met him, he looked uncertain. Ms. Martinez, I owe you an apology. When you first came to me with your claim, I approached it with skepticism based on the limited documentation in your file. I see now that this skepticism was misplaced. Sarah felt a surge of emotion but kept her voice steady. Sir, I don't need an apology. I need recognition that my injuries are real and service-connected. I need the support and benefits that were promised to me when I enlisted. You're going to get them, Thompson said firmly. I'm going to personally review your case with the medical board, and I'm going to recommend full approval of your disability claim. Furthermore, I want to make sure this documentation becomes part of your permanent record so that there's never any question about the legitimacy of your injuries again. Dr. Chen smiled for the first time since entering the office. Colonel, I hope this case will also serve as an example for other veterans who have faced similar challenges in proving their service-connected disabilities. Thompson nodded slowly. Dr. Chen, I think you're right. This case has opened my eyes to some serious flaws in our evaluation process. We need to do better at recognizing that combat injuries don't always present themselves in neat, well-documented packages. As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned back to Colonel Thompson one more time. Sir, there's one more thing. I want to make sure that other veterans who were injured in chaotic situations don't have to go through what I went through to prove their injuries are real. Agreed, Thompson replied. I'm going to work with the medical staff to develop better protocols for evaluating cases where initial documentation may be incomplete due to battlefield conditions. Your case is going to help other veterans, Ms. Martinez. Walking out of the building, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The fragments beneath her skin no longer felt like reminders of trauma. They felt like badges of honor, proof of her service and sacrifice that had finally been recognized and respected. 6 weeks after her meeting with Colonel Thompson, Sarah received an official letter in the mail that would change her life forever. The envelope bore the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was brief but powerful. Her disability claim had been approved with a rating of 70%, acknowledging her service-connected traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and hearing loss. But the victory felt different than Sarah had imagined it would. Instead of pure relief or celebration, she found herself thinking about all the other veterans who might be struggling with similar battles against bureaucracy and disbelief. The approval of her claim wasn't just a personal victory, it was proof that the system could work when presented with undeniable evidence and persistent advocacy. Dr. Chen called her the same day the letter arrived. Sarah, congratulations. I heard the news from Colonel Thompson's office. How are you feeling about everything? Grateful but also overwhelmed, Sarah admitted. It's been such a long fight that I'm not sure what to do with myself now that it's over. But Dr. Chen, I keep thinking about something Colonel Thompson said about developing better protocols for other veterans. I want to be part of that. Actually, that's why I'm calling, Dr. Chen said. Colonel Thompson reached out to me yesterday. He wants to work with both of us to create a new evaluation process for veterans with combat injuries that may have been inadequately documented during their initial treatment. He's asking if you would be willing to share your story as part of this initiative. Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. If my experience can help even one other veteran avoid what I went through, then everything I endured was worth it. 3 months later, Sarah found herself standing in front of a conference room full of VA medical staff, administrators, and veteran advocates. Colonel Thompson had organized a comprehensive training session on identifying and properly evaluating combat-related injuries that may have been underdocumented due to battlefield conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, Thompson began, his voice carrying a weight of conviction that Sarah had never heard before. Today we're going to discuss a critical flaw in our evaluation process, and we're going to learn from a case that nearly slipped through the cracks due to our own institutional skepticism. Sarah stepped forward to address the group, feeling nervous but determined. My name is Sarah Martinez, and 3 years ago, I was a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne in Afghanistan. When I came home with traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and hearing loss from an IED explosion, the VA initially denied my disability claim, not because my injuries weren't real, but because they weren't properly documented in the chaos of a battlefield medical facility. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who held the power to approve or deny claims for thousands of veterans. I want to show you something that changed everything about how my case was evaluated. Sarah turned slightly and lifted her hair to reveal the small, dark fragments visible beneath the skin along her hairline and neck. The room fell silent as she continued speaking. These are pieces of the explosive device that nearly killed me and did kill my fellow soldier, Private Jackson Miller. For 2 years, these fragments remained hidden evidence because no one thought to look beyond the initial medical reports that were written during a medical emergency. Dr. Chen stepped forward to present the medical findings. What you're seeing here represents a common challenge in combat medicine. Injuries that seem minor during initial treatment can actually be indicators of serious trauma. The fragments visible in Ms. Martinez's body provided incontrovertible proof of blast exposure, but they were never documented because the medical staff was focused on more immediately life-threatening injuries. Colonel Thompson addressed the group with obvious emotion in his voice. I was the administrator who initially denied Ms. Martinez's claim. I approached her case with skepticism because the documentation seemed incomplete. I failed to consider that incomplete documentation might be a result of battlefield conditions rather than an indication of fraudulent claims. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. Colonel Thompson, how do we balance the need for thorough evaluation with the reality that many legitimate cases may lack perfect documentation? That's exactly what we're here to address, Thompson replied. We need to train our staff to recognize the signs of inadequately documented battlefield injuries. We need to understand that sometimes the absence of documentation is itself evidence of the chaotic conditions under which our service members were injured. Marcus Rodriguez, who had flown in specifically for this training session, spoke next. As military medical personnel, we need to understand that our field documentation will sometimes be incomplete. But that doesn't make the injuries any less real or any less deserving of recognition and treatment. Sarah returned to the podium for her final remarks. I want everyone in this room to understand something important. When you deny a legitimate claim, you're not just denying benefits, you're telling a veteran that their sacrifice doesn't matter, that their pain isn't real, that their service wasn't worthy of recognition. The psychological impact of that denial can be as damaging as the original injury. After the presentation, several staff members approached Sarah with questions and comments. Many shared stories of cases they had evaluated that might have been handled differently with this new perspective. Sarah realized that her individual struggle had become something much larger, a catalyst for systemic change that could benefit thousands of veterans. Dr. Chen found her as the conference was ending. Sarah, I have something to tell you. Colonel Thompson has recommended your case as a model for the new evaluation protocols. Your documentation is going to be used as a training example for VA staff across the country. Really? My case is going to help train other people? More than that, Dr. Chen continued. The VA is developing new guidelines specifically for evaluating combat injuries with incomplete initial documentation. They're calling it the Martinez Protocol. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her persistence had accomplished. What had started as a personal fight for recognition had evolved into a systemic change that would help countless other veterans facing similar challenges. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment, looking at the framed copy of her disability approval letter. Next to it was a photograph from her deployment, showing her with her medical unit in Afghanistan. Private Jackson Miller was in that photograph, young and smiling, unaware of the tragedy that awaited him. For the first time since his death, Sarah felt like she had honored Jackson's memory in a meaningful way. By fighting for her own recognition, she had created a system that would better serve other veterans who had sacrificed for their country. The fragments beneath her skin were no longer just evidence of trauma. They had become symbols of resilience, determination, and the power of truth to overcome institutional skepticism. Sarah picked up her phone and called her mother, who had supported her throughout the long battle with the VA. Mom, it's over, and it's just beginning. What do you mean, sweetheart? The fight for my benefits is over, but the fight to help other veterans is just getting started. I think I know what I want to do with the rest of my life. What's that? I want to become a veteran advocate. I want to help other people navigate the system so they don't have to fight as hard as I did to get the recognition they deserve. Sarah's mother was quiet for a moment before responding. Sarah, I think that's exactly what you're meant to do. You found a way to turn your pain into purpose. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. The scars beneath her skin would always be there, reminders of a day when everything changed. But now they represented something different. They represented the beginning of her real mission, helping other veterans find their voices and claim their rightful place in a system that owed them recognition, respect, and support. 2 years after the implementation of the Martinez Protocol, Sarah stood before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee as an expert witness in hearings about improving VA disability evaluations. She had spent those 2 years working as a veteran, advocate, helping dozens of former service members navigate the complex disability claims process. Her organization, Warriors Truth Initiative, had become a respected voice in veteran advocacy circles. Senator Williams, members of the committee, Sarah began, her voice steady and confident. When I first sought recognition for my service-connected disabilities, I was told there wasn't enough evidence to prove my injuries were real. Today I want to tell you about Maria Gonzalez, a Navy corpsman whose claim was initially denied 3 times before the Martinez Protocol helped evaluators recognize the legitimacy of her blast-related injuries. Sarah had learned that her story was not unique. Across the country, veterans with inadequately documented battlefield injuries had been struggling against a system that prioritized paperwork over the reality of combat medicine. The Martinez Protocol had already helped approve hundreds of previously denied claims, but Sarah knew there was still more work to be done. Senator Williams leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, can you explain to the committee how the protocol named after your case has changed the evaluation process? Certainly, Senator. The Martinez Protocol requires VA evaluators to consider the battlefield, conditions under which a service member was injured. If medical documentation is incomplete or minimal, evaluators now look for alternative evidence, physical evidence like embedded fragments, testimony from fellow service members, and medical opinions about injury patterns consistent with specific types of combat trauma. Sarah gestured to a large display showing before and after statistics. Since implementation, claim approval rates for combat-related TBI and PTSD have increased by 43%. More importantly, the average processing time has decreased because evaluators now have clear guidelines for assessing cases with incomplete initial documentation. Colonel Thompson, who had become an unexpected ally and friend, was also testifying that day. Senators, I want to emphasize something crucial about Ms. Martinez's case. The problem wasn't that our staff lacked compassion or dedication. The problem was that we lacked the tools and training to properly evaluate combat injuries that didn't fit neatly into our existing documentation requirements. Sarah watched as Thompson addressed the committee with the same conviction he had shown during their training sessions. Their relationship had transformed completely. He was no longer the skeptical bureaucrat who had initially dismissed her claim, but a passionate advocate for systemic reform. Ms. Martinez, Senator Rodriguez asked, what challenges remain in helping veterans receive appropriate recognition for their service-connected disabilities? Sarah had been preparing for this question. Senator, while the Martinez Protocol has helped with inadequately documented injuries, we still face challenges with delayed onset conditions, particularly PTSD and TBI symptoms that don't manifest until months or years after discharge. We also need better training for private physicians who treat veterans, so they understand how to document service-connected conditions properly. After the hearing, Sarah met with Marcus Rodriguez, who had become the national coordinator for combat medic training programs. He had used his experience from Sarah's case to develop new protocols for field medical documentation that would prevent future cases from falling through the cracks. Sarah, I have news, Marcus said, as they walked through the Capitol building. The Department of Defense has approved our new field documentation protocols. Starting next month, all combat medics will be trained on recognizing and properly documenting blast-related injuries, even during mass casualty situations. That's incredible, Sarah replied. That means future veterans won't have to fight the battles we fought. Exactly. And there's something else. The military is implementing a new follow-up system for all service members who experience blast exposure. Mandatory neurological and psychological evaluations will be conducted 30 days, 90 days, and 1 year post-exposure to catch delayed onset symptoms. As they reached the steps of the Capitol, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from the frustrated veteran who had first walked into Colonel Thompson's office. The fragments beneath her skin had become more than evidence, they had become symbols. of a movement that was changing how America treats its wounded warriors. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. "Sarah, just wanted you to know that the medical journal published our research paper about blast injury documentation. The Martinez case is now required reading in military medicine residency programs. You're literally changing how doctors are trained to recognize combat trauma." That evening, Sarah returned to her small apartment, which had become the headquarters for Warriors' Truth Initiative. The walls were covered with thank you letters from veterans whose claims had been approved using the Martinez Protocol, photos from congressional hearings and newspaper articles about the changes sweeping through the VA system. Sarah's laptop chimed with an email notification. It was from a young Marine named David Thompson, no relation to the colonel who had been injured in Syria. His initial claim had been denied, but he had heard about Sarah's work and was asking for help. As she read his story, Sarah saw painful similarities to her own experience. Battlefield injuries inadequately documented due to emergency conditions, symptoms that developed over time, and a system that initially failed to recognize the connection between his current struggles and his military service. She immediately typed a response offering to review his case and connect him with medical professionals who understood combat trauma. As she wrote, Sarah realized that each veteran she helped represented not just an individual victory, but another step toward a system that truly honored the sacrifices made by those who served. Later that night, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, gently touching the familiar bumps along her hairline where the shrapnel fragments remained embedded beneath her skin. She had been offered surgical removal of the fragments multiple times, but she had chosen to keep them. They had become part of her identity, reminders not of trauma and defeat, but of resilience and the power of persistence in the face of institutional skepticism. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Colonel Thompson's name on the caller ID. "Sarah, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to tell you about something that happened today." "Of course, Colonel. What's going on?" "A young veteran came to my office today with a claim that would have been automatically denied 2 years ago. Blast injury, incomplete field documentation, delayed onset symptoms. But because of the Martinez Protocol, we were able to approve his claim on the first review. I thought you should know that your fight is still helping people every single day." After hanging up, Sarah sat at her desk and opened a new document on her computer. She began typing the outline for a book she had been thinking about writing, a comprehensive guide for veterans navigating the disability claims process. The title came to her immediately: "When the System Fails, a Warrior's Guide to Fighting for Recognition and Justice." As she wrote, Sarah thought about Private Jackson Miller, whose death had haunted her for years. She realized that by helping other veterans, she was finally fulfilling the promise she had made as a combat medic to heal and protect her fellow warriors. Jackson's death had not been in vain if it motivated her to prevent other veterans from suffering in silence. Sarah's story had become larger than her individual struggle. The fragments beneath her skin had sparked a movement that was transforming how America recognizes and treats combat injuries. From congressional hearings to medical training programs, from revised VA protocols to new military documentation procedures, the impact of her persistence was rippling through systems and institutions across the country. The young woman who had once sat in Colonel Thompson's office pleading for someone to believe her story had become a national advocate whose work was ensuring that no veteran would have to fight alone for the recognition they deserved. The scars of war, both visible and hidden, had been transformed from sources of shame into badges of honor and catalysts for change. Sarah saved her document and closed her laptop, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans to help, and new battles to fight against bureaucracy and skepticism. But tonight she allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for every warrior who had carried hidden wounds home from distant battlefields. The fragments beneath her skin pulsed gently with her heartbeat, eternal reminders that sometimes the most powerful evidence of courage and sacrifice is carried quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to change the world.